Welcome back, and thank you for joining me for part 2 of determining the objectively strongest type in Pokémon. If you haven't yet seen part 1, I urge you to watch that first, otherwise this video will spoil it for you and you would be robbed of the enjoyment of watching a guy talk about numbers for some 40 minutes. In this video we're setting out on a search for ultimate power. We're turning off all the safety valves to answer the one question on our collective mind. When nothing is held back, which Pokémon type is the strongest? Last time we excluded all legendary Pokémon as well as all Mega Evolutions, Mythic Pokémon, Ultra Beasts, and, somewhat controversially, Ash Greninja. This time, however, all those Pokémon are welcome back. But allow me a quick minute first to explain the method I used to reach this factually, most scientifically accurate answer to the question at hand. In the main series of Pokémon games, starting from Generation 2 and onwards, every Pokémon has 6 different stats that determine, along with other, less important factors, how strong it is. These 6 stats are HP, Attack, Defense, Special Attack, Special Defense, and Speed. Each of these stats can vary from 1 to 255, but usually fall pretty far from either extreme. When we're trying to find out which type is the strongest, we're not interested in averages. We do not care that the normal type has an average attack stat of 73.87. We're only interested in the highest stat for each type. Say we're trying to determine the strength of the rock type, and that there are only 2 rock type Pokémon in existence, Rampardos and Bastiodon. Of the 2, we see that Rampardos has the highest HP stat with 97, the highest attack with 165, the highest special attack with 65, and the highest speed with 58. Meanwhile, Bastiodon has the highest defense and special defense with 168 and 138. When we add all these numbers together, we get 691. This would have been Rock's base stat total had it not been for the fact that there are 76 more Rock-type Pokémon we have to consider. When doing this, we are ignoring stats that are affected by abilities. So even though Mega Mawile's attack stat is effectively 259 thanks to its ability Huge Power, we are using 105 as the official number for our ranking. I should explain what I mean by that, just so that there's no confusion. Huge Power and Pure Power are abilities that Pokémon can have that double the Pokémon's attack stat. When people talk about Huge and Pure Power, they will often say that what's doubling is not the base stat, but the actual stat. But what does that mean? Well, we're going to have to look at some numbers and a graph in order to get a proper explanation. This graph shows how high a Pokémon's attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed stat can be, depending on what their base stat in that stat is. HP's graph is a little bit different, but don't worry about that for now. What is important is that we start at 108. Yes, even if a Pokémon were to have a base stat of 0 in attack, if the Pokémon has 31 IVs and 252 EVs in that stat combined with the right nature, again, ask WolfGlick if you have any questions, you could theoretically get that stat up to 108. Remember that number because we'll be coming back to it later. For every extra point in a Pokémon's base stat, it can get an average of 2.2 points to that stat, which comes out to 11 points per 5 levels, 22 per 10 levels, or 55 per 25 levels. So while a Pokémon with a 100 base attack stat can have a max attack stat of 328, a Pokémon with a 125 base attack stat can have a maximum of 383, 55 points higher. Mega Mawile has a base attack stat of 105. This means that if you were to max out its attack at level 100, its attack stat would be 339. If Huge Power doubles the base attack stat of Mega Mawile, its base attack stat would be 210, and at level 100 it could have a max attack stat of 570, which, don't get me wrong, it's very high, but it's not the base stat that's being doubled. Instead, it's the stat itself once IVs, EVs, and nature is put into the equation. So, since Mega Mawile's attack stat was 339, we double that to 678, and then we have to calculate the base stat from there. Very easy, you just plot it into this handily ready equation we get from Bulbapedia, solve for x, and you get 259, an attack stat so ridiculously high it breaks the rules for what's possible. If you don't feel like dusting off your high school calculus textbooks to calculate a Pokemon's base stats based off its stat total, here's a little secret they don't tell you in trainer school. If you take the total stat, subtract the 108 and then divide it by 2.2, you also get the base stat. This also works the other way. If you know a Pokemon's base stat and want to know how much it can possibly get in that stat, multiply its stat by 2.2 and add 108. Works every time, but only if its IVs and EVs are maxed out and it has a nature that boosts that stat. Otherwise, it's back to the equation. Okay, that was a very long explanation for why we're not considering boosts from abilities. Now on to rule number 2. In Generation 8, Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing was introduced. This divisive mechanic raises a Pokemon's HP stat, but not its base stat. Therefore, we will be ignoring Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing, the same way we ignored Huge and Pure Power. If you take offense of this, I encourage you to seek out your nearest Ash Greninja fan and tell them all about how unfair it is. Third, I did say every Pokemon was allowed in this ranking. Well, I lied. In Generation 8, during the climax of the story, you face a certain Pokemon whose powers go far beyond anything we have seen so far. I am talking, of course, about Eternamax Eternatus. It has a base stat total of 1125, which alone would have put it comfortably on top of the previous ranking, without the help of any other Pokemon. Had it been possible for a trainer to catch and use this Pokemon, I would have had to include it in the ranking. However, to this date, you cannot use Eternamax Eternatus without some third-party software. Therefore, I will exclude it from the ranking, until that dark day comes when the Pokemon Company decides it's time to give us what we never wanted and never asked for. If you think this is unfair, consider the Starmobiles. Just like Eternamax Eternatus, they are bosses you fight in the game with their own types, base stats, and moves. Cash's fighting type Starmobile has a base HP stat of 408, a number that is impossible for Pokemon to actually have in-game. So the only rule for if a Pokemon is banned or not is, have you ever been able to catch it and use it in a mainline game? This also tosses out Primal Dialga, not Origin form Dialga, but Primal Dialga out of the ranking, as well as the Pokemon from Pokestar Studios. Sorry, but Monica is banned. And finally, we must consider Arceus. The god of the Pokemon world has a base stat total of 720, evenly distributed to 120 in every stat, and an ability allowing it to have every type in the game, depending on which plate it's holding. Arceus could force every type to never have a stat below 120, and I will mention it whenever it's relevant, but to make each type a little bit more unique, we will only consider Arceus to be a normal type Pokemon. But even though all types now have access to every usable legendary, mythical, ultra beast, and mega, henceforth referred to as legends and megas, the distribution of them is far from fair and equal. While the type with the fewest legends and megas only have 8, other types have more than 30. Before we begin, let us briefly look at the ranking for all types when we excluded all the legends and megas. At the bottom, with a stat total of 750, we had the Dark type. It was followed by Fighting at 774, then Grass at 780. These three were the only ones below the 800 line. I am happy to inform you that all of these types are now far beyond 800. In fact, there are no types with a stat total below 850. However, while 2 of these 3 types have managed to climb up on the rankings, one of them have fallen from grace. Sadly, this also ends the discussion about which starter type is the weakest, because in 18th place, we find the Grass type. It carries over 3 stats from the previous ranking. Even when we include legendaries, Go-Goat, with 123 base HP, is still the healthiest Grass type. Good job, Jita. Meanwhile, Ferrothorn still has the highest defense with 131, now shared with the Ultra Beast Kartana, and Hisuian Electrode is still the fastest, rolling in at a base 150 speed. As for the smallest stat increase, it is the 15-point increase gained from Wuchien, the Generation 9 legendary that is part of the Treasures of Ruin quartet. With 135, it has the highest special defense of any grass type. Mega Sceptile's 145 special attack is 20 points higher than Arboliva or Executor, who held the spot in the last ranking. There's always a chance that some of you skipped a generation or two, so allow me to briefly explain what Mega Evolutions are. They're cool. They're really cool. A Mega Evolution is a mid-battle temporary evolution to a Pokemon. It is achieved by the Pokemon holding a corresponding Mega Stone. In Sceptile's case, it would be the Sceptilite, while Garchomp would need to hold the Garchompite. You, the player that is, then press a button on your Mega Bracelet or Keychain or Mega Sock or whatever it is that you own that is imbued with Mega Energy, and your Pokemon Mega evolves through a process that may or may not be extremely painful. When that happens, the Pokemon gets a 100-point boost to its base stats, distributed between all stats except HP. Sceptile goes from having a 530 base stat total to 630. We're going to be seeing a lot more Mega Pokemon as this goes on, but not in Grass's attack stat, because the greatest increase, and by far Grass's highest stat, is the 181 base attack stat of Kartana, an incredible 50 points more than Delmise had in the last ranking. When we add these 3 newcomers together with the old, we get a stat total of 865, 85 points higher than the previous ranking, but interestingly, this would only have gotten it up to 7th place. This time though, Grass sits all alone, well below any other type. Without spoiling too much, I can say that Grass, with an average placement of 17th, is the official worst type in Pokemon. This is despite the fact that Grass actually has 18 Legends and Megas, which is a very average number if we're going by median values. To make matters worse for the Grass type, despite being a full 35 points away from the 900 line, it is the only type not to make it past the 900 line. And interestingly, the Great Gatekeeper this time is the same as we had for the 800 bracket last time. Coming in at a perfect 800 last time, the fire type set the bar for what it means to be a respectable type. Now, having fallen 2 positions from 15th to 17th, it still sort of functions in that role, just to a lesser degree. Only one Pokemon is carried over from last time, Galarian Zenmo Darmanitan. Despite adding Megas and Legends, no fire type manages to outpace its 135 base speed. The smallest increase comes in the form of the HP stat, which goes up only 5 points, from Emboar's 110 to Entei's 115. This is the first case of a stat being below the Arceus line, but far from the last. As for attack, we're going Primal. The 160 attack of Zenmo Darmanitan is replaced with a whopping 180 from Primal Groudon. Torkoal's 140 defense also falls to the Primal Titan, who has a 160 defense, a 40-point increase from Primal Groudon alone. In the last ranking, if we combine the fire type's attack and special attack stat, we would get a total of 305, the highest combined offensive stat of any type. This time, however, the type sees itself beaten by multiple types in the combined offense category. While Chandelure had the highest special attack stat of any last time, with its base 145 special attack, Mega Charizard-wise 159 doesn't even break into the top 10 highest special attacks. Ho-Oh kicks Iron Moth and Flareon out of the ranking with its 154 special defense, a 44-point increase, and I do wonder if we'll see any evolutions this time. When we add it all together, we end up with exactly 900. And 903. It's not as satisfying as last time with the perfect 800, but it's tantalizingly close. And interestingly enough, the fire type and the grass type have almost the exact same number of legends and megas, with the fire type having a total of 17. Hey, still no sight of last time's worst type yet. I wonder where it's gone. From battling it out with the mighty dragon type to tumbling down 2 places along with the fire type, the poison type also finds itself in the bottom 3. But to fall from a shared 13th to a 16th place can be more easily understood when it comes to this particular type. You see, for the first 6 generations, the poison type was not given a single legendary or mythic Pokemon. Not until the Ultra Beast came along did they get any kind of special Pokemon, and the first actually legendary Pokemon didn't come until Generation 8. Currently, their total Mega and Legendary count stands at 12. As with the Fire type, only one Pokemon is carried over from last time, and unsurprisingly, it's Toxapex, whose 142 special defense stands undefeated. Clodsir's 130 HP is replaced by the now semi-banned Eternatus, who in its normal form has a base 140 HP. Then in attack, we find a Pokemon whose stats were inexplicably designed by a 13-year-old boy with 3 cans of Monster Energy drink surging through his veins, Mega Beedrill. With a special attack stat of only 15, but an attack stat of 150, 20 higher than Sneasler, Mega Beedrill has an offensive stat difference of 135, the most egregious case of min-maxing of any Pokemon if we calculate by percentage, and the second worst if we look at the stat difference. In other words, Arceus' perfect creation. In the defense category, we find the first Mythic Pokemon. You might be wondering how a Mythic Pokemon is different from a Legendary. Well, apart from Arceus, they all have a base stat total of exactly 600 and share the wonderful trait that Game Freak didn't really want you to have any of them. I mean, they do, but they used to be only obtainable via events or DLC, often forcing you to go to a physical store and talk to an adult stranger, until Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire broke the trend by letting you catch one in-game without the need of DLC. Anyway, Pecharunt, the most recent mythical Pokemon from Scarlet and Violet, has a base defense stat of 160, 8 points higher than Toxapex. But it's the special attack that's the most exciting. Because in the last ranking, we had to say goodbye to Gengar, after 8 generations as the best special attacker Poison had to offer. Now, however, he's back with a vengeance. Mega Gengar's enormous 170 special attack is 30 points higher than Iron Moth. With a 145 speed stat, 15 points up from Crobat, Mega Beedrill returns to send the Poison type all the way to 907, 83 points up from last time. It's only 4 points above the Fire type, meaning that if you use Arceus' 120 for Fire's HP stat instead, Fire would leapfrog it by a single point. Still no sight of the Dark type, but we're out of the bottom 3 and our next 2 types are within a single digit of each other, meaning it's time for the very first duel of this ranking. In the previous ranking, we saw Electric go up against a type that I described as its polar opposite, Psychic. But perhaps the best type to exemplify this dichotomy between technology and magic is Pokemon's newest type, Fairy. Having only existed for a few generations, few meaning 1 to 4 of course, it's not surprising that it might have fallen a few spots in the ranking when the other types are allowed to add all their old favorites. Will it struggle against a type that has been here since the very beginning? Well, you might be surprised to learn that the Fairy type has a total of 20 legends and megas, while the Electric type, which got its first legendary back in the very first generation, only has 14. The Electric type carries over 2 Pokemon from last ranking. Iron Hands, with its 154 base HP, is still the thickest Electric type we have. Do people still say thickest? And Alolan Golem's 130 base defense is 10 points higher than the highest of any legendary, namely Zekrom. Meanwhile, the Fairy type has 3 stats carried over. Wigglytuff's base 140 HP remains to be beaten. The same goes for Florges' 154 base special defense. No surprises for the last one, as only 4 Pokemon have a higher special defense than Florges. Carbink also retains its position on the ranking, though it is now joined by its mutated form Diancie. Both of them have a base 150 defense. Before we add any new stats, the Fairy type leads by 845 to Electric's 826, a 19-point lead. Let us start at the bottom and work our way up. For Electric, that means Miraidon's 115 special defense. In the last ranking, the Appliance Rotom's 107 special defense was the lowest of any type, and even though it has now been increased by 8 points, it is still the lowest for any type. And yes, it's 5 points below the Arceus line. Meanwhile, the Fairy type's lowest stat increase is the 13 points increase to speed, from Fluttermane's 135 to Zacian's 148 in its Crown Shield form. Following that, we have another low increase for the Electric type. Although it could not overtake Iron Hands in the HP category, Zekrom's 150 attack is 10 points higher than the Paradox Pokemon's 140. However, the most observant viewer will remember that 150 was the lowest attacks that we will see in these rankings, meaning that the Electric type has managed something quite frankly impressive. 2 of its stats are the lowest of any type. Last time no type had more than 1 stat that was the lowest in its category, and maybe Ash should have dumped that Pikachu after all. 2 stats remain for both types, and Fairy now only has a 14-point lead, with 858 versus Electric's 844. But the Electric type is finally getting itself together. With 173 special attack, Xurkitree surges the Electric type ahead with a 28-point increase. Unfortunately for the Electric type, the next stat for the Fairy type is a 29-point increase, also in special attack from Hatterini's 136 to Mega Gardevoir's 165. A 15-point lead for the Fairy type. And then something rare happens. For in the attacking category for the Fairy type, we should be looking at Crowned Sword Zacian again. When it was introduced and given a rusted sword to hold, its attack stat sprang up to 170. But because Game Freak are cowards and didn't like the fact that it dominated every facet of competitive play, Zacian had its attack stat cut by 20 points going into Generation 9. Since there are no Gen 9 Pokemon on the list for the Fairy type, this means Fairy becomes the first ever type to become weaker between generations. Instead, it has to contend with the 160 attack stat of Mega Diancie, a 30-point increase from Iron Valiant. A 45-point lead. Some of you already know what's coming. There's a speed limit in Pokemon. If your Pokemon has a speed stat, not base speed stat, but a speed stat of over 1808, it becomes so fast that it even outspeeds the very things that are meant to slow it down. I'll let someone else explain just how it works, but what it means is that if you have a Pokemon with a base speed stat of, say, 200, you could fairly easily go past it. Regieleki, as it happens, has a base speed stat of 200. It's an astounding 50 points faster than Electrode from the previous ranking and is just enough to squeeze past the Fairy type, sending Electric to 14th, down 2 places from last time, while Fairy falls 6 places and ends in 15th. We've still seen no sign of last time's worst performer, the Dark type, nor have we seen any type that has managed to actually climb in the rankings. One of those are about to change with our next duel. According to the Pokemon Company, you cannot punch a ghost. You can punch grass, water, and beings made out of magma, but ghosts are where the Pokemon Company draws the line. But that is exactly what the fighting type is going to have to do if they want to keep climbing in the rankings. Because our next duel is between the hard-hitting fighting type and the elusive ghost type, the Annihilate duel, or Marshadow Throwdown, if you will. It should be a lopsided fight. Among legendaries and megas, the fighting type is among the most common types, with a total of 26 legendaries and megas being at least part fighting type, nearly twice as many as that of the ghost type, who only has 14. Once again, let us start with our carryovers from last time. For the fighting type, and for the final time, Iron Hands secures a spot in the list, with its 154 HP. This is, however, the only carryover for the fighting type. Meanwhile, the ghost type has 2. One of them is also the HP stat. Drifblim's 150 is still the highest, although it's now shared with both forms of Giratina. The other is the fan favorite friend of the channel and winner of the most appearances award in the last video, Aegislash. 140 is still the highest for the Ghost in the special defense category. The smallest increase for the Ghost type is found in the speed category. Shadow Rider Calyrex has 150 base speed, 8 points higher than Dragapult. The smallest increase for the fighting type is a 15-point increase. However, it should have been 20. Because of Zacian's rampage through the competitive scene, its brother, Zamazenta, also got nerfed, even though it had done nothing wrong. Its defense stat was slashed from 845 to 140 in its Crown Shield form. It's still the highest of any fighting type, though, and a 15-point increase from Komodo. The second lowest increase for the Ghost type is a 10-point increase to defense, from 150 to 160, coming from the mythic Pokemon Pecharunt. Sadly, this marks the end of the road for the non-fully evolved Pokemon Doublade, who made it onto the list last time. Zamazenta then makes it back to the list, and again, it should have been a 145, but the fighting type has to make do with 140, this time in special defense. It's a 25-point increase from Gallade's 115. We then get both of Ghost's offensive stats, as they've both gotten a 25-point increase. First, Mega Banette's 165 pushes Aegislash's 140 off the list, while the original Ghost, Gengar in its marvelous Mega form, has a base special attack stat of 170, 25 points higher than Chandelure and Cursola, who both had the highest special attack stat of any last time. With that, the Ghost type is done. It ends up on 935, 68 points higher than last time. Only a few other types actually have a lower increase than the Ghost type. The difference is now at 121, but the fighting type still has 3 more stats to go. The fastest ever fighting type is the Ultra Beast Pheromosa, with its 151 base speed stat, a 31-point increase from Sneasler. 151 would have been enough for second place last time. This time, the fighting type just misses out on the top 3 podium, and is instead the 4th fastest type. 2 stats remain, but the difference sits at 90. The fighting type would have to bring out someone sensational to overtake the Ghost type. They would need someone whose stats go way beyond what's reasonable. And that is exactly what a fighting type does. Like a blast from the past, Mewtwo is back, but this time in its Mega X form. And what a glorious sight it is to see. First, 154 increases the special attack from 120, the lowest of any last time, to a very respectable 154. Then, with 190, Mega Mewtwo X gives the fighting type its rightful crown. No other type has a higher attack stat, and it's a 50-point increase from last time. Is it enough to overtake the Ghost type? No. But the fighting type can still be pleased with its performance. A 155-point increase, the 5th highest of any type, and it climbs 4 spots on the list. Meanwhile, the Ghost type falls 6 spots, out of the top 10 and down to 12. We move on to the last type to fall outside the top 10, and unlike Ghosts, it's one of the most punchable types out there. What makes a Pokemon normal? It's one of those questions that someone ought to make a very long and needlessly complex video on. If a Pokemon is just a Pokemon, it's normal. But if it knows how to throw hands, slap a fighting type sticker on it and send it to war. Either way, the normalest of types found a hole in our ranking and it wedged itself in there. It has no next door neighbor for it to compete with. This is normally where I would go for the type's carryovers, but normal has brought along 4 stats from the previous video, so instead we're doing them one by one, the old-fashioned way. You already know what its highest stat is going to be. It's the de facto decision maker when it comes to determining how high a stat can go, and I'm talking of course about Blissey, and its incredible 255 base HP stat. In all the years since Generation 2, it has remained untouched, although there are some that have crept a little bit closer in recent generations. As for attack, 160 is still the highest, now held jointly by both Regigigas and Slaking. A duo unlikely to make most lists of best Pokemon, but there you go, no bullying, leave the lads alone. I talked a lot about the defense stat for normal type last time, and how it was, well, not great. Very bad, some might even say. I'm happy to inform you that it has increased since last time, and unhappy to inform you that it's still the lowest of any type. For with an increase of just 6 points, Blood Moon Ursaluna's 120 is replaced with the only Mega Pokemon from Generation 5, Mega Odino, and its 126 base defense. On to special attack. 135 special attack was, in the last ranking, very respectable. It sat only 10 points from the top, which was 145. Now, however, it's the worst special attack of any type. Porygon Z, Drampa, and Blood Moon Ursaluna are joined by Mega Pidgeot, as the normal type picks up its second dishonorable award. Between electric and normal, we've seen 4 of the lowest stats. That to me is one of the craziest stats in this entire ranking. The special defense stat has also remained stationary at 135, and is once again held by Blissey, before finally the speed stat has seen an increase of 10 points, going up from Swellow's 125 to Mega Lopunny's 135. This means that the type that ended in 3rd place last time has only managed a 16-point increase and falls a record 8 spots all the way down to 11th. You might have already guessed it, but no other type will have as low an increase as the normal type. Is this a big surprise? Not really. There were only 10 legends and megas for the normal type to choose from, and with many of them being a little bit too balanced, the normal type gets the shortest end of a very short stick. But the time has come to leave behind the rabble. We've seen the lower 8 duke it out. Now it's time to enter the top 10, where the true juggernauts are. This duel is between 2 very different types. One has carried over 3 Pokemon from last time, while the other consists entirely of new entries, the first to do so. One is an established top 10 type, the other has crawled its way up from the very last place in the last ranking. One of the types is in the top 3 when it comes to having most Megas and Legends, while the other had a below average number until Generation 9 came around. It's time for a battle between Dark and Flying. Like I said, not a single one of Dark's Pokemon are carried over into this ranking. It's not too surprising when you consider its abysmal performance last time. While for the Flying type, Drifblim is still the Pokemon with the most HP at 150, Skarmory's 140 defense is still the highest, and Ninjask, the fastest Pokemon in our previous ranking, is still the fastest Flying type at 160. But even before a single new stat has been added to either type, Flying has a perfect 100-point lead. The Dark type has some serious ground to cover. Let's work our way up again, starting with the lowest stat increase. It comes in the form of a 5-point increase to the Dark type's special defense stat. Wu Qian makes his second appearance on the list, and simultaneously pushes Umbreon out of the rankings. That's 2 evolutions gone, only Glaceon remain. Second, we once again turn to the Dark type. This time it's a 10-point increase from the Dark Ice Weavile's 125 base speed to the Dark Ice type Qian Pao's 135 speed. It's almost like there's a thing with Dark Ice types and having a crippling desire to go fast. That's 2 stats down for the Dark type, but the deficit has only been cut by 15 points. It's still a comfortable lead for the Flying type. Up next, we finally get to see one of the Flying type's new stats. With their 154 special defense stat, Ho-Oh and Lugia kick Mantine off the list, breaking up the beautiful Gen 2 combo we got to see last time, and send the Flying type back up to a 99-point lead. The current score is 765 for Dark versus Flying's 864. But it's time to bring out the big boys, and I mean the truly big boys. Last time I made a big deal out of the power of pseudo-legendary Pokemon. This is not an official term by the Pokemon Company, but it's been in my vocabulary for too long for me to change it now. Last time around, the majority of the legends, these 3-stage Pokemon with a base stat total of 600, made it onto the list, including Metagross, as is fitting for the Psychic type. This is the lowest attack stat we're going to be seeing in these rankings. Again, sorry about forgetting about Metagross. This time, however, only 2 remain, and one of them is someone who didn't make it to the list last time. When Generation 6 introduced Mega Evolutions, they did not simply hand them out to weaker Pokemon that truly needed them. No, that would be cowardly. Several were also given to some of the Pokemon with already high base stat totals. Tyranitar was one of 4 pseudo-legendary Pokemon to not make it onto the list last time. Mega Tyranitar is a different story. With an attack stat of 164, 25 points up from Roaring Moon's 139, the Dark type finally has a stat above 140. But the legally distinct from Godzilla Pokemon is not done yet. For the defense stat of 150, 30 points up from King Gambit, Mega Tyranitar takes another spot on the rankings. But if giving Tyranitar a Mega Evolution was a questionable decision, there is one Mega Evolution that takes the concept to a ridiculous level. Remember when I said that a Pokemon needs to hold a corresponding Mega Stone? Like Tyranitar needs to hold a Tyranitarite, thus making it unable to hold a different item that could give it some benefit? Well, what if you took a Pokemon with one of the highest base stat totals in the game, gave it a Mega Evolution, and then removed that stipulation just for fun? I am talking, of course, about Mega Rayquaza. Yes, that's how you say its name, Rayquaza. Instead of having to hold a certain item, it only needed to know a specific move, Dragon Ascent, a 120 power, 100% accurate move whose only drawback was that it also lowered the user's defense and special defense, which of course didn't matter because whatever you hit would already be dead anyway, because this 120 base power move was coming off Mega Rayquaza's 180 base attack stat. Did I mention that this thing can learn Dragon Dance? or sword stance, and hold an item like a life orb. With 180 base attack, up 40 points from Archeop's 140, the flying type surges back to an 84 point lead, with a 904 to Dark's 820. But the Dark type has 2 stats remaining versus Flying's 1. Mega evolutions were not the only interesting thing Generation 6 did. By letting Pokemon swap between different forms, you ended up with horrors like Hoopa Unbound, whose massive 170 special attack, 45 points up from Hydreigon's 125, cuts the deficit to 39. But of course, Mega Rayquaza can't just be good at one thing. It also needs to be good at dropping Draco Meteors at its opponents. For its special attack is also 180, a full 60 point increase from what used to be the lowest special attack of any type, the 120 of Togekiss. 60 points, the largest increase we've seen thus far. The flying type ends up on 964. It sits 99 points ahead of the dark type at the moment, and in order for the dark type to catch up, it would need to bring out a Pokemon with a base HP stat of over 210. Do you know how many Pokemon in this ranking has a base HP stat that high? It's 3. Or 4 if you include Chansey. The Ultra Beast's design were experimental, to say the least, especially when it came to stat distribution. For some reason, all their stats are prime numbers, meaning the Ultra Beast Guzzlord couldn't have a nice round number like 210 as its base HP stat. For those, a number that can only be divided by itself or 1 without creating decimals. So 1 is a prime number, 2 is the only even number that's a prime number, 3 is a prime number, but 4 is not, as it is divisible by 2. Not all odd numbers are prime. 9 can, as you know, be divided by 3, resulting in 3. So Guzzlord's HP stat couldn't be 210. Instead, the number kept crawling up, past 211, and now it had to keep going since there were no more prime numbers before 220, which of course can also be divided a lot of different ways. 221? No, not a prime number. It's divisible by 13 and 17. So on it went, past 222, until it arrived at 223. Flying stopped at 964, a 114 point increase and still fell 2 spots. Guzzlord pushes Dark to 977, a full 227 point increase from last time. As a reference, Wimpod has a 230 base stat. It's like they added a whole extra Pokemon to their previous stat line. Only one other type will manage a greater stat increase than the Dark type. Last time, only 2 types managed to get past the Millennium line. As we prepare for the duel between Steel and Water for the 7th place, we're going to be pushing very, very close to it. There's a 6 Pokemon difference in the Legendary and Mega count for the 2 types. Water sits at 18, right next to Fire and Grass, very cool. Steel, however, is in the top 5 most numerous types, with a total of 24. The Steel type only carries over 1 stat from last time, 150 base special defense. It was previously held by Hisuian Gudra and, to my great shame, Probopass, who, just like Metagross, I forgot to mention. I completely forgot that Probopass was Steel type and not just a rock. Luckily, it didn't affect the ranking. 150 is now also the base special defense stat of Registeel, one of the 4 Regis who make it onto the list. The Water type takes a more traditional approach, by which I mean it carries over 4 stats from the last video, the most of any type along with normal type. I'm not sure if you've noticed yet, but a lot of types struggle to increase their HP stat. The same goes for Water. Wailord's 170 base HP is still the highest, as is Palafin's 160 base attack stat, Cloyster's 180 defense, now shared with Mega Slowpoke, and Iron Bundle and Barraskewda's 136 base speed stat has yet to be surpassed. So, right off the bat, Water has a 67 point lead, with 928 versus Steel's 861. The lowest stat increase belongs to the Steel type. Both forms of Dialga, by which I mean regular form and the origin form, have a base special attack stat of 150, 10 higher than Aegislash. Side note, Primal Dialga has never been in a mainline Pokemon game, and thus doesn't have an official base stat total. It has only ever been in the spin-off game Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time and Explorers of Darkness, or PMDAFTUED for short. A game in which stats works in a very different way than the mainline games. The only thing Bulbapedia has to say about Primal Dialga's stats is that it has 700 HP when you fight it at level 48, which would be equivalent to having a base HP stat of at least 621, which no! The second lowest stat increase is the 15 point increase to the Steel type's HP stat, from the Copper Skin Pokemon Copperage's 122 to Solgalio's 137. Melmetal, who was introduced in Pokemon Go, is only 2 points off making it onto the list for the Steel type. Next is one of the 2 Water Pokemon to make it onto the rankings. Or rather I should say, the only new Pokemon to make it onto the list for the Water type. While Primal Groudon took 2 spots on the Fire type's list, Primal Kyogre will also take 2 spots on the Water type's list. It starts off with a 160 special defense stat, up 18 points from Toxapex's 142. If you have Toxapex PTSD, don't worry, that's the last time I'll mention it. With that, the water type only has one more stat to go. It currently sits at 946. The steel type, with 3 more to go, sits at 887, a 59-point difference. Up next, we have a very big number. The stat increase is only 30, but that is because we're building upon Steelix's massive 200 base defense stat. You see, I really love Megas, and I love Aggron despite its flawed disposition. Mega Aggron, though, is another one of Arceus's perfect creations. With a base defense stat of 230, the same as Mega Steelix, the two Megas bring Steel type to the very top of the category. Next, Zacian makes another appearance. Although it had its offensive stats nerfed, its speed is still 147 in its crowned sword form, 38 points higher than a lowland duck trio. No more cool surfer dudes on the list, I'm afraid. The last stat for the water type, Primal Kyogre's massive 180 special attack, is, along with Mega Rayquaza, the second highest special attack we're going to see, and sets the water type's total to 986, 58 points up from last time. It just misses out on the bottom 3 as far as stat total increases go by 1 single point. If you're a human calculator, you know what this means for the steel type. If its final stat increase is greater than 40, that means the victory over the water type is already assured. But can it make it past the 1000 line? Oh, it's close. It's really close, but with a 41 point increase to attack from Aegislash's 140 to Kartana's 181, Steel ends up on 996 points. 4 points away from the Great Threshold. Steel also becomes the first type to remain stationary in the rankings. While Water falls 4 spots from 4th to 8th, Steel remains in 7th. For our next duel, we're looking at the 2 of the types that have had the greatest stat increases of any. Get your Yachi berries ready as Ground and Dragon battle for a spot among the top 5. Last time around, Dragon ended up on a disappointing shared 13th place, on the same stat total as the Poison type. Meanwhile, Ground just managed a top 10 spot, ending on a shared 9th with Fairy type, Dragon's natural enemy. The first legendary Ground type Pokemon was added in Generation 3. We've already seen him pop up once in his primal form, and we'll see him again real soon. But the Dragon type also had to wait until Generation 3 to get its own legendary Pokemon. As a compensation, Game Freak gave it 3, with Rayquaza, Latias, and Latios. Since then, Game Freak never really looked back, and every single generation since the 3rd has featured a legendary Dragon-type Pokemon. As a result, there are now 36 legendary and Mega Dragon types, far beyond any other type we've seen so far, despite it being one of the rarest types in the game. Meanwhile, the Ground type has only a third of that. It typically gets a new legendary Pokemon every other generation, and combined with its Megas, it ends at 12. But will a numerical advantage be enough for the Dragon type to make it into the top 5? It has already secured a great victory in finishing above both the Fairy and the Steel type, its 2 main competitors on the competitive scene. Now all that remains is to see how high up the rankings it can climb. Dragon carries over 2 Pokemon from the last ranking. 150 is still the highest special defense, although Mega Latias now joins the 2 Gudras in the ranking, while Turtonator's 135 defense barely escapes the bottom 3 in its category. But like I said last time, Dragon is an offensive type, so who cares about defense? Ground also carries over 2 stats. First, there's the 120 special defense of Claydol, Toadscrew, and if you will, Arceus with an Earth Blade. It's the second lowest special defense of any type. But the other stat it carries over is a stat it probably wishes even more it could have improved upon. For the very last time in this ranking, we see a non-legendary, non-Mega Evolved Pokemon from the 1st generation. Duck Trio is nearly twice as fast as the average fully evolved Ground type, but 120, right on the Arceus line, is now the lowest speed stat of any type, and by a solid margin too. Going into the duel, Ground has a 21 point lead, with 845 to Dragon's 824. This lead is cut short by the smallest stat increase we'll see today. Look closely at the Dragon type speed column. You see that? That was a 3 point increase from Dragapult's 142 to Mega Sceptile's 145. Next, we go back to the primeval Titan of the Earth. For even though it is by most considered to be a physical attacker, Primal Groudon still has a very impressive 150 special attack, which is up 15 points from Blood Moon Ursaluna. We stick with the Ground type a little bit longer, as the next stat increase is a 30 point increase to its defense stat. The Dragon type might not care too much about it, but the Ground type certainly does. Mega Steelix once again improves on regular Steelix's 200 base defense, bringing it up to 230, the highest defense stat of any type. The Ground type suddenly has a 63 point lead, with an 890 total to Dragon's 827. But then we hop from the ground to the sky. While the primal versions of Groudon and Kyogre might be very similar to Mega Evolutions, they are functionally different. Groudon and Kyogre still need to hold their respective stones, the red and blue orb, but you, the player, don't get a say in when they revert to their primal forms. The moment they hit the field, it's back to the Stone Age, and a 100 base stat total is added to their stats, but not to their HP stats. Since this doesn't count as a Mega Evolution, you could still use a Mega Pokemon alongside them. That way, you could have a Primal Kyogre, a Primal Groudon, and a Mega Rayquaza on your team as you take on 2 random trainers who just wanted to have a swim in the middle of the ocean of Hoenn. All this just to say that Mega Rayquaza is of course the Pokemon with the highest attack stat of all Dragon types. At 180, its attack stat is 33 points higher than that of Haxorus, who held the position last time. Alright, back to the Ground type. Its attack stat is also 180, held by, say it with me, Primal Groudon. It's a 40 point increase from Rhyperior and Ursaluna. Back to the Dragon type. Its penultimate stat is its special attack. Care to guess which Dragon type Pokemon has the highest special attack? That's right, you got it! It's Mega Rayquaza at 180, 45 points up from Drampa. With the Power Crept Gen 3 legends out of the way, Ground's lead has held firm with 930 versus Dragon's 905. And it should be nearly impossible for the Dragon type to catch up, because the final Ground type is one of the oddest Pokemon we have on the list. Unlike all other Pokemon that we talk about that change form, Zygarde's base HP stat also changes. But not every Zygarde, only the ones with the Power Construct ability, and only if its HP falls below 50% in battle. How do you get a Zygarde with the Power Construct ability? Well, according to the official Pokemon guide, you have to blah blah blah, who cares? The important thing is, once it changes from either 10% or 50% form into its completed form, its base HP stat is increased to 216. That is an 86 point increase from Clodsire and, for the last time, Ursaluna. Ground ends up on 1016, the first type today to break the Millennium line. But while Ground's 86 point increase to its HP stat is impressive, Dragon's is even bigger. With a 223 base HP stat, Guzzlord increases Dragon's HP stat by 108 points, which is 3 points short of salvaging the 5th place. Instead, Dragon ends in 6th at 1013, while Ground finishes on 5th with 1016. With a 189 point increase, Dragon is the type with the 3rd largest point increase, while Ground, with a 171 point increase, has the 4th highest increase. We move on to the type that just misses out on the top 3 spot, but still manages to do very well for itself. It's the type that everyone else is wrong about, the Ice type. Despite relentless bullying, despite carrying over 3 stats from last time, despite everything stacked against them, Ice is one of the most complete types in the game. It is one of only 2 types to have 5 of its stats above 170, and of all the types to make it into the top 5 last time, it has the highest stat increase by a solid margin. The very first legendary Pokemon in the Pokédex, Articuno, is an Ice type. Despite that, the Ice type has the 4th fewest legends and megas with 11 total. Like I said, 3 stats are carried over. Titan becomes the 9th Pokemon to have its HP stat carried over, Avalug's 184 defense is also still the highest for the Ice type, and Iron Bundle is still the fastest at 136. Hey, side question, do you like Pokemon Infinite Fusion? You know, the game where you take Mr. Mime and Pinsir and you create your very own sleep paralysis demon, and then you go and fight youngster Joey and his double Rattata fusion? Well, in Generation 5, Fusion was first introduced to the Pokemon world, though in a very limited form compared to Infinite Fusion. If you had Kyurem and either Zekrom or Reshiram, you could fuse them into Kyurem Black and Kyurem White for a hefty stat increase. Kyurem Black's 170 attack stat is the highest for any Ice type, up 10 points from Galarian Zenmo Darmanitan from the last video. Meanwhile, Kyurem White has a 170 base special attack, up 40 points from Glaceon, and with that, all evolutions are unfortunately gone. Very sad, but we do press on. Finally, Regice, or Regice if you're a heathen, comes in with a 200 base special defense stat, a full 65 point increase from Cryogonal's 135. With that, the Ice type ends on 1030, and with a 115 point increase. Should Game Freak ever give us what we all really want, a really fast Ice type, it might one day challenge for the top 3 position. But for now, it has proven all its doubters wrong and cemented itself as one of the very, very best types in Pokemon. And that is an undisputable fact. If you've been paying close attention, you might be able to name the 3 types we have left. Last time it came down to the very last stat to determine a winner, between the Bug type and the Rock type. In the end, Rock won by just 8 points, but I have a sneaky feeling that once we get the most anticipated rematch of 2024 going, it will be even closer. Despite these 2 types sitting here at the very top of the ranking once again, they are the 2 types with the fewest legends and megas. It took 5 generations before the Bug type got any special Pokemon. In Generation 5, the world was introduced to the mythical Pokemon Genesect via event distribution, which means that most players probably never even had one until it was redistributed in Generation 6. Then, in Generation 7, we got 2 Bug-type Ultra Beasts in Buzzwole and Pheromosa. And that's it! There's never been a single actual legendary Pokemon that's just Bug-type, and if we ignore Mythic and Sub-Legendary, the complete number is 0. If we do count all Sub-Legends, Legends, and Mythicals, Bug-type makes up less than 2.5%. 1 in 18 would be 5.5%, so no matter how you look at it, Game Freak is holding them back. Is it because the type would be too powerful if it got some legendary Pokemon? Absolutely. We can sprinkle on some Mega Evolutions on top, but it's still not a good look when the other types have more than 30 Legends and Megas. The Rock type doesn't do much better, although it did get its first legendary Pokemon all the way back in Gen 3. This one was much easier to attain as a child than some event distribution Pokemon. Now all you had to do was learn how to read Braille, find a Pokemon with a 5% spawn rates in 2 very specific locations, and solve a cryptic riddle. Once you did, you could set out and catch Regirock, one of only 4 Pokemon with a stat over 200 that doesn't actually feature in this video. Since then, it got another legendary Pokemon in Generation 5 with Terrakion, a mythical Pokemon in Generation 6, some Ultra Beasts and more Legends in Generation 9, and a few Megas, and you at least end up with a better total than the Bug type, though not by a lot. Yet here we are once again. The 2 types many consider to be among the weakest have proven themselves to be 2 of the strongest. It is time to settle this grudge match once and for all. Let's just get it out of the way right away. Yes, Shuckle is still here, and yes, it is still the king of these rankings. It once again has the highest defense stat and the highest special defense stat, not just for both the Bug type and the Rock type, but for all Pokemon in our rankings. With 230 base defense and special defense stat, no Pokemon comes close to being this dominant. Once again, this duel is off to a very fast start, as both types sit at 460. Now let's start at the tail end of things and work our way towards the HP stat. For the Bug type, Ninjask is still the fastest Pokemon at 160 base speed. This, of course, used to be the fastest Pokemon in our ranking, but it has now fallen to a 3rd place. The fastest Pokemon for the Rock type used to be Aerodactyl, the fossil Pokemon from Kanto. And in a way it still is. Mega Aerodactyl is 20 points faster than regular Aerodactyl, coming in at 150. 3 Pokemon down, and Bug is up by 10 points. But moving on to the special attack category, we find another stat that has not moved for the Bug type. Just like normal type, Bug has 4 unchanged stats. It's still Generation 7's Vikavolt, with its previously record-setting 145 special attack that holds the position for Bug. Rock, on the other hand, once again whips out a Mega Evolution. 160 was not enough to secure the spot for the Fairy type, but it is enough for the Rock type. With 160, 30 points up from Glamora, Mega Diancie, the only mythical Mega Evolution, sends the Rock type ahead to a 5-point lead with 770 versus Bug's 765. 2 stats remain. Out first, Rock type's attack. It would have taken something truly spectacular to beat Rampardos' 165. It was, after all, the highest attack stat of any Pokemon last time. Mega Tyranitar comes very close with 164, and Mega Diancie's 160 is not far behind either. But Rampardos remains the king as the hardest hitting of all Rock types. But it doesn't hit as hard as the hardest hitting Bug type. Last time around, Heracross's 125 attack was 10 points away from getting onto the list. But remember when I talked about Mega Beedrill some 50 minutes ago? I said it had the 2nd worst case of min-maxing if you look at the difference between its attack and special attack stat. Well, that's because Mega Heracross exists, and with a ridiculous 185 attack, 50 points up from the last ranking, 145 points higher than its own special attack, and 30 points higher than the next Bug type, it shoots Bug into a 15-point lead with 950 over 935. All Bug has to do is stick the landing. Find a Pokemon with a semi-decent HP stat, and victory is theirs. One point. One single point. Aurora's once again brings Rock to the top with its base 123 HP stat. Rock ends at 1058, while Bug ends on 1057. But there was no need for Buzzwole's HP to be 107. Yes, it has to be a prime number, but there were so many to choose from. You know what else is a prime number? 109! Take 2 points from its 139 defense stat and turn it into a 137, also a prime number, and you know what you get? You get Bug on top with Rock below. You know what? Screw it. Give Arceus its plates. We're going back and we're handing out some plates. Fire's HP stat is now 120, and Fire leaps over Poison by a single point. Electric's special defense is 120 without it improving its ranking at all, though it does get close to the fighting type. Arceus appears twice for the ground type in both speed and special defense without actually raising its stat total at all. And finally, Arceus, with an insect plate, kicks Buzzwole out and raises Bug's HP stat by 13 points and Bug's total to 1070. Rock ends on 1058, a 50-point increase, second lowest of all, while Bug wins with a 70-point increase, the 5th lowest. Or rather, Bug wins the second place trophy. Because there's a type that I have been, shall we say, hesitant to talk about, a type that no other type manages to come close to. When Mr. Game Freak thinks of a legendary Pokemon, he thinks of a psychic type. When Mr. Game Freak thinks of a mythical Pokemon, he thinks of a psychic type. The first truly legendary Pokemon we ever got was no other than Mewtwo. Alongside it, totally hidden under a truck, you just weren't skilled enough to find it, we also got Mew. These two Pokemon set the standard for what a legendary and a mythical Pokemon should be. Mewtwo was not designed to be fair compared to other Pokemon in its generation. It was faster than all except one, had the highest special stat of all, the 7th highest HP stat, and had a solid attack and defense. It was designed to be broken, and it was just that. With the way the game worked back then, with special attack and special defense being only one stat and critical hits being calculated off the speed stat, it was the undisputed king of kings back then. Meanwhile, Mew's design was a lot more fair and balanced. It has a 100 in every stat, but the ability to learn any move made it the most versatile Pokemon in the game. This design philosophy of giving a mythical Pokemon 100 base stat in every category lasted all the way up until Generation 4's Manaphy and Shaman, in its land form at least, and Generation 5's Victini. But another thing that remained constant was that the Psychic type and legendary Pokemon were a perfect fit. In Generation 2 we got Lugia, another Psychic type legendary and someone we've seen on this ranking already. Alongside Lugia, we also got Celebi, the time-traveling onion, celery Pokemon. Again, they made a whole movie about it, go watch that. Generation 3 gave us two more legendary Psychic types, in the two Latias, Latias and Latios. These version exclusives are very similar stat-wise, with Latias favoring defense and Latios favoring offense. Alongside them, we also got two Psychic Mythic Pokemon, namely Jirachi and Deoxys. Deoxys could even come in many different forms, depending on which Generation 3 game you were playing. Generation 4 gave us the Lake Trio, beings that represent part of the indomitable human spirit. This was also the generation that every competitive player's favorite wall was introduced, Cresselia. When it was introduced, it had better defensive stats than Arceus himself, but they were nerfed in Generation 9 because competitive players are cowards. The first Pokemon in the Generation 5 Pokédex is Victini, the fire psychic mythical Pokemon, only catchable via events. This Pokemon also had a tendency to come with the move V-Create, a move so cool only 3 Pokemon have ever been able to learn it, and one of them is Smeargle, and we don't really count Smeargle, do we? But Victini was not the only mythical Pokemon from Generation 5. Meloetta, the Melody Pokemon, is also part Psychic type in its Aria form. Generation 6 then became the generation with the fewest legendary psychic Pokemon, introducing only one, or 1.5, or 2. It's really up to you how you want to count the two different forms of Hoopa. In its confined form, the Mischief Pokemon has a base stat total of 600 and is a Psychic Ghost. But if you poke it with a bottle, it changes into its Unbound form, and its stat total shoots up to 680. It also changes typing into a Psychic Dark type and develops a crippling Arachnophobia. Generation 7 got things back on track, introducing a whole slew of Psychic Pokemon. The story in the game revolves around the Pokemon Cosmog, who eventually evolves into Cosmoem, and finally into either Lunala or Solgaleo if you pick the wrong game. That's 4 Psychic Pokemon right there, but it gets so much worse, because the game also gave us Necrozma, and Necrozma can fuse with Lunala and Solgaleo to create Dawnwing Necrozma and Duskmane Necrozma. And finally, it could turn into Ultra Necrozma. That's another 4 legendary Psychic type Pokemon right there, and you also had Tapu Lele, a Psychic Fairy type Pokemon. Generation 8 gave us another 3 legendary Psychic types, again, through the magic of fusing Pokemon together. Calyrex, the king of bountiful harvests, can fuse with either Glastrier or Spectre, becoming Ice Rider Calyrex or Shadow Rider Calyrex. Both versions are, once again, part Psychic type. By my count, Generation 9 also introduced 4 legendary Psychic types, though feel free to debate that countdown in the comments. While Munkidori is undeniably a legendary Pokemon, the Paradox trio of Iron Leaves, Iron Boulder, and Iron Crown are not technically listed as legendary Pokemon, but their design is based off of other legendary Pokemon. Their stats indicate that they stand above other Paradox Pokemon, and the game does everything in its power to make them appear legendary. Once we add the 10 Mega Pokemon, again, more than any other type, we end up with a total of 46, simply in its own category. To Mr. Game Freak, the perfect legendary Pokemon is a Psychic Dragon, but certainly Psychic first. We start things off with the only carryover from last time. It is the Pokemon with the 6th highest HP stat of all eligible Pokemon, Wobbuffet. It has one of the most unique playstyles in the game, but it's a playstyle that requires a lot of HP. Luckily, a 190 HP all but assures it can take a hit and then strike back for an instant KO. When looking at the Ice type, I mentioned how it was one of only 2 types to have 5 stats over 170. Well, the Psychic type is the only type to have all stats over 160. For its lowest stat is 160 base special defense stat. It gets it from Deoxys in its defense form. This is tied for the 4th highest special defense stat of any type, and is a 40-point increase from last time when Orbeetle, Claydol, and Mr. Mime held the position. As for the 2nd lowest stat, it's a tie, but it's a silly tie. It's a 180 speed stat and a 180 defense stat. It gets the 180 speed stat from, once again, Deoxys in its speed form. This is the 2nd highest speed stat of any, and an insane 60-point increase from Alakazam. As for the defense stat, it gets it from Mega Slowbro. At 180, it is actually only the 6th highest of any type, with Bug, Rock, Steel, Ground, and Ice all beating it. But then, the king is back. For in both attack and special attack category, we find Mewtwo. For attack, it's Mega Mewtwo X with 190 attack, the highest of any type, and a 55-point increase from Metagross's 135 last time. But the special attack is even higher. At 194, Mega Mewtwo Y sits alone at the top, 54 points higher than Zenmo Darmanitan last time. Had it not been for Mega Mewtwo Y, attack from Deoxys' 180 would still have been the highest of any, tied with Mega Rayquaza and Kyogre. All this comes out to a total of 1094. It's an increase of 259 from last time, the biggest increase of any type. It's what you would get if you added an entire Y0 to the previous ranking. And there we are. The ranking is over. The winners and losers revealed for all the world to see. Finally, we can put the discussion to rest. The top 3 types in Pokemon, if we count all obtainable and usable Pokemon, are Psychic in first, with Rock and Bug fighting for 2nd and 3rd. Fire, Poison, and lastly Grass make up the bottom 3. These rankings are irrefutable. It has been my pleasure to bring them to you. Now I will return to my slumber until Pokemon ZA is released. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good night. Oh, if you feel it's unfair that Eternamax Eternatus was left out, here is what it would have done to the rankings. Poison ends up with a total of 1,220 and is only beaten by Dragon, which ends up at 1,260. But this is dumb and stupid and doesn't count. Bye!